Decoded.
Welcome back to Book Decoded, where we crack open these insightful books for busy folks who are, always hungry to learn new stuff.
Right.
And today we're diving into a book that really grapples with, I think, a feeling we all know too well: outrage.
Yes.
It's called Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground.
Okay.
By Kurt Gray, who's a social psychologist.
Oh, very cool.
So,
yeah, this is a very relevant topic, right?
Yeah.
It seems like even though we're statistically safer than ever,
Right.
the world often feels
Undivided.
angrier and more divided.
Yeah.
Kind of a paradox.
It's like our news feeds are on fire, but our actual lives are pretty chill.
Exactly.
So Gray kind of sets out to understand this, and one of the first things he does is he challenges this classic image of humans as killer apes.
Oh, interesting.
This idea that we're naturally aggressive and bloodthirsty.
Right. Yeah, I've heard that before.
Instead, he suggests that for most of our evolutionary history, we were actually prey animals.
Prey animals.
Huh? I mean, think about it. We don't have sharp claws or teeth.
Right.
We're not particularly strong or fast.
Not really.
So we were basically the appetizers on the savannah buffet.
Yeah, I like that. Right. The appetizers.
And Gray even shares this crazy story about his own near-death experience with a lynx.
Oh, wow.
He was on a research trip, and let's just say it was a stark reminder of how vulnerable our ancestors were.
I bet.
I mean, can you imagine?
Yeah, a lynx.
Like that image of this lynx stalking him?
Yeah.
It just really paints a picture.
It does.
And it makes you realize why we might be so sensitive to even small threats today.
Right.
It's like that ancient fear is still wired into us.
Makes sense.
And this sensitivity to harm, as Gray explains, is a key part of our morality. It's like this system that evolved to help us avoid danger and live together in groups.
Right.
But instead of lions and tigers, the new threats were other humans.
Other humans.
We became each other's predators,
Interesting.
in a sense. That's a good way to put it, yeah.
So morality developed as a way to protect us from harm, both physical and social.
Okay.
Like, think about the classic free rider problem.
Yes.
Where someone slacks off in a group project.
Yeah.
The worst.
The worst.
It's like we're all in this tug-of-war together, and you're just standing there.
Right.
Even seemingly small harms like that can really damage a group.
Yeah, for sure.
And Gray argues that even though we're statistically safer now,
Okay.
our definition of harm has expanded.
Oh, interesting.
It's like this concept creep where we react to things our ancestors might not have even noticed.
Makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
He talks about how even exposure to relatively minor harms can make us perceive trauma more easily. It makes you wonder if all this hypersensitivity to harm is actually making us less resilient in the long run.
It's a good question.
Right.
It is. And it connects to what we see in parenting today, where we're so protective of our kids, even though statistically childhood is safer than ever before.
For sure.
So maybe all those bubble wrap playgrounds aren't actually doing us any favors.
Right.
But that kind of leads into another point Gray makes about how we tend to view morality in very black and white terms. It's like we're constantly moral typecasting, putting people into categories of either villains or victims. We're oversimplifying these really complex situations.
Right.
And that can make it hard to see the nuances of harm and responsibility.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people can be both victim and perpetrator.
It's true.
It's rarely a simple good guy, bad guy scenario.
Right.
And that kind of rigid thinking makes it even harder to find common ground because we're not really engaging with the full picture.
Yeah, we're not seeing the other person
Right.
as a complex individual with their own story and motivations.
Okay, so we've talked about our evolutionary history with harm,
Uh-huh.
this concept creep,
Right.
and how we tend to oversimplify morality. But where does outrage come into all of this?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Gray argues that a big part of it comes down to something he calls moral egocentrism.
Moral egocentrism.
It's this very human tendency to assume everyone else shares our moral views.
Which, spoiler alert, they rarely do.
Right, exactly.
And when we bump up against those differing viewpoints, it can trigger a wave of outrage.
For sure.
It's like, how can you not love pineapple on pizza?
There it is.
It's the perfect combination of sweet and savory.
That's funny.
Right.
So that's exactly what Gray is getting at.
Yeah.
It's not about pineapple on pizza, of course.
Right.
It's about how these visceral personal experiences
Yeah.
shape our moral judgments and make it difficult to understand
Yeah.
why someone might see things differently,
Totally. Right.
Yeah, and when those differences like play out on a larger scale,
Right.
that's where we start to see those political divides and conflicts that Gray's trying to unpack in the book.
Okay, so how do those differences actually play out? It can't just be about pineapple on pizza, right?
Right. It's much deeper than that, that Gray suggests that those political disagreements often stem from different assumptions about who's most vulnerable in society and therefore most in need of protection.
So it's not necessarily about having different values,
Right.
but rather having different ideas about who needs our help the most.
Exactly. And Gray points out that liberals tend to view marginalized groups and the environment as more vulnerable to harm, while conservatives often see everyone as equally capable of being harmed. And both of these perspectives shape their approach to policy and lead to some pretty heated debates.
So how do we even begin to bridge these divides? Feels like everyone's just talking past each other these days, especially online.
Well, Gray argues that simply throwing facts at each other doesn't really work. It's like, have you ever changed your mind about something deeply personal because someone hit you with a statistic?
Nope, definitely not. It usually just makes me dig in my heels even more, so what's the alternative?
Gray suggests that instead of facts, we need to focus on sharing stories, specifically stories of harm. He even cites research showing that personal stories, especially those about difficult experiences, can actually foster understanding and respect, even in those heated online discussions.
That's really interesting. It makes sense those stories help us connect on a human level. It's like
Yeah.
if you hear someone share their personal experience with discrimination or injustice, it's much harder to dismiss their perspective.
Yeah, it's like you're seeing the world through their eyes, even for a moment, and that can be a really powerful way to build empathy and understanding.
Okay, so sharing stories is important, but it can also be really difficult. I mean, talking about personal experiences of harm, that takes a lot of vulnerability.
You're absolutely right, and Gray acknowledges that. He even talks about how these conversations need to happen in a space where people feel safe and respected.
So how do we create that kind of space, especially when we're talking about these really charged topics that tend to trigger strong emotions?
Well, Gray suggests starting by simply acknowledging the humanity of the other person. Remember that idea of invitational rhetoric we touched on earlier?
Oh, right. It's about extending that invitation to understand someone's viewpoint instead of just trying to shut them down or prove them wrong.
Exactly. It's about saying, hey, I'm genuinely curious about your perspective, even if I don't agree with it. And then really listening to what they have to say, not just waiting for your turn to speak, but actively trying to understand where they're coming from.
So it's about curiosity, open-mindedness, and active listening. It sounds simple enough, but I imagine it's pretty challenging to put into practice, especially when you feel strongly about something.
You're right, it takes effort and it doesn't always work perfectly. But Gray argues that even if you don't change each other's minds, the act of listening and trying to understand can be a powerful step toward bridging those divides.
And sometimes just feeling heard and understood can be enough to de-escalate a conflict.
Absolutely. And another really important part of this process is validation. And before you say it, I know it doesn't mean agreeing with the other person. It means acknowledging that their feelings and experiences are valid, even if you see things differently.
Right. So it's like saying, I hear you. I understand that this is important to you. It's about recognizing their perspective, even if you don't share it.
And that kind of validation can be incredibly powerful. It can help the other person feel seen and respected, which can open up the possibility for a more productive conversation.
So it's like you're saying, hey, we might not agree on everything, but I respect you as a person and I value your perspective.
Exactly. And Gray argues that this kind of respect is essential if we want to find common ground.
That's so true. I mean, think about the people in your life that you disagree with. Are you more likely to listen to them if they make you feel respected?
Definitely when someone makes you feel like your perspective matters, even if they disagree, it makes it so much easier to hear what they have to say.
Okay, so we've got curiosity, active listening, validation. Sounds like a lot of work, but are there any practical tips for actually putting this into practice? Especially when you're dealing with a relative who always brings up politics at Thanksgiving dinner.
Well, one thing Gray suggests is to try a little thought experiment. Imagine you have to argue for the opposing viewpoint.
Whoa, that sounds tough. But I get what you're saying. It forces you to step outside your own moral bubble and see things from a different perspective.
Exactly. And you might even discover some valid points you hadn't considered before.
That's a great point. It's like, instead of just assuming the other side is wrong, try to understand why they might believe what they believe, what experiences might have shaped their viewpoint.
And that leads into another important point Gray makes about the dangers of moral typecasting. That tendency to see people as either pure villains or innocent victims.
Right, like the world is full of good guys and bad guys, and there's no in between.
But that's just not how real life works. People are complex. We can be both capable of great compassion and prone to selfishness. We can be both victims of harm and perpetrators of it.
It's rarely a simple black and white situation, and realizing that can help us resist the urge to typecast, to see the other side as simply bad or wrong.
Absolutely, because when we typecast, we're essentially dehumanizing the other person. We're not seeing them as a complex individual with their own story and their own struggles.
And that's what makes it so hard to have those productive conversations, because we're not really engaging with the full person.
Exactly. And Gray reminds us that recognizing the shared humanity in all of us, even those we disagree with, is crucial to bridging those divides.
It's about remembering that at the end of the day, we're all just trying to navigate this world the best we can. We all want to feel safe and secure, and we all want to protect those we care about.
And even though we might have different ideas about how to achieve those goals, like recognizing that shared desire for safety and security can help us find a little more compassion and understanding, even amidst all the outrage.
Okay, so recognizing our shared humanity is important, but how do we actually have those tough conversations without things getting, too heated, especially when it feels like everything is so polarized these days?
Well, Gray reminds us that understanding doesn't necessarily mean agreement. We can understand where someone's coming from. We can empathize with their experiences without necessarily agreeing with their conclusions.
So it's not about trying to convince everyone to see things our way. It's more about trying to see things from their perspective.
Exactly. And sometimes that shift in perspective can be enough to de-escalate a conflict and create space for a more meaningful conversation. And remember that idea of moral egocentrism.
Oh, right, that whole pineapple on pizza dilemma, where we assume everyone shares our moral views even though they clearly don't.
Yes. Well, going into conversations with that awareness, knowing that the other person might have completely different assumptions about harm, vulnerability, and morality can help us avoid those knee-jerk reactions of outrage and judgment.
It's like instead of thinking, how can they possibly believe that, we can start to ask ourselves what experiences might have led them to this conclusion.
And that shift in thinking, that curiosity can make a world of difference in how we approach those tough conversations. It allows us to engage with the other person's perspective, even if we don't agree with it.
So Gray is basically encouraging us to be more curious, more open-minded, more willing to step outside our own moral bubbles, which, let's be honest, is a lot easier said than done.
Oh, absolutely. It takes effort and it's an ongoing process, but the more we practice these skills, the better we'll get at navigating those difficult conversations and maybe finding some common ground.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up our dive into Outrage. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I know I've learned a lot.
Me too. It's such a timely and relevant book, and I think Gray offers some really valuable insights into why we're so quick to outrage these days and what we can do about it.
Yeah, he doesn't just leave us with a bunch of theories. He actually gives us some practical tools to help us have more productive conversations about these really tough topics.
Absolutely. And we encourage you to check out the book for yourself and, continue exploring these ideas because at the end of the day, bridging those divides starts with each of us. It starts with our willingness to be curious, to listen, to validate, and to remember our shared humanity, even in the midst of disagreement.
Well said. And on that note, thanks for joining us on Book Decoded. We'll catch you next time with another insightful read.